Hello everyone. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to this video focusing on John Milton's Sonnet 19. Now, as we look at Sonnet 19, I'm very much taking this as an opportunity to show you what I think everyone should know when reading this sonnet. And this is specifically designed to help you with your AS in English language and literature for the WJEC qualification. Now, we know that Milton wrote Sonnet 19 after 1652. And at this period of history, England was going through very tumultuous changes. Ever since the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, a lot happens in a very short space of time. And I think to read Sonnet 19 without understanding some of that context would be a mistake. You wouldn't understand what this poem says in relation to all of that historical context. So before I get anywhere near the poem, I'd like to spend a long time looking at lots of different historical contextual details that I think will leave you with a much better understanding of this poem. So, with that in mind, I'm going to very quickly give you a brief history of English monarchs, and I'm particularly focusing on these. Ever since Henry VIII all the way up till Charles II, knowledge of that will really help us understand this poem. You already know who Henry VIII was. Your studies throughout school have focused quite strongly on Henry VIII as a monarch. And he lived from 1491 to 1547, and despite dying 100 years before this poem, I think his influence is actually quite profound. Henry VIII changed England forever. And instead of bringing stability and careful leadership like a good monarch should, he made decisions that resulted in division within his country. He wasn't the type of king that brought people together. He was the type of king that made decisions that caused fractions, that caused schisms, that caused rifts in the country that he was supposed to protect. But you already know what Henry's main problem was when he was alive. His issue was that his wife, Catherine of Aragon, couldn't provide him with a legitimate heir. It was very important that Henry produced a legitimate male heir. Primogeniture states that the kingdom will go to the firstborn male son, and to protect the country it was important that a son was born. But Catherine of Aragon couldn't give him what he wanted to. So he had a decision to make. What he could have done was legitimize one of his illegitimate children. That's right, he had illegitimate children. So one of them was Henry Fitzroy, but if he were to do that, he would need the Pope's approval, and it wouldn't be a convenient way of passing on his country because he would easily be challenged due to his illegitimate status. So I think Henry decided that that wasn't the most appropriate course of action. Secondly, he could have made his daughter, Mary, marry as quickly as possible and have a child before Henry died, so that that child could inherit the throne as his grandchild. That way, he wouldn't be challenged for the throne, he would be a legitimate heir, but that would require waiting and hoping that Mary was capable of doing that. Again, that's a decision that he didn't take. Now, his third option was perhaps finding a way of annulling his marriage to Catherine so that he could marry someone else. And that's the course of action that Henry decided on. But at the time, there was a lot of conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism. There was a problem with trying to divorce his wife. Henry was a Catholic, and England was a Catholic state. Divorce is not permitted in Catholicism. So Henry VIII would need the Pope to agree to annul the marriage. So he took his argument to Pope Clement the Seventh in 1527. But the Pope refused to annul the marriage. The Pope's refusal meant that Henry made a decision that changed the course of England's history. He started what is known as the Reformation. The Pope's refusal to give him that divorce or annulment meant that Henry began the process of changing the entire country from a Catholic nation to a Protestant nation. And that is not an easy thing to do because it causes huge amounts of upheaval for the population. The entire population of England would have to accept to change their fundamental beliefs that they had held from birth. And those who refused, they were arrested and they were accused of treason. And many of these dissenters were executed, even if they were noblemen or church elders. For the first time, the king and pope were in opposition, and loyalties must have been really difficult to judge. The entire country wouldn't be sure whether they were supposed to follow this tyrant king or whether they should keep their allegiance to the pope. There's a very clear difference between deciding to follow your faith or follow your patriotism. Now, Henry VIII believed that this was one of his rights as a king. He believed in the divine right of kings. He believed that God had appointed him, above all, to be the ruler of this country, and that nobody could challenge him, because if they were challenging his decision, they were therefore also challenging the authority of God. So Henry VIII believed that he had the power of God over his country. The difference between Protestantism and Catholicism can be seen on your screen. Protestants believe in sola scriptura, which means they only really believe what the Bible says. Whatever is in the Bible is what God wanted to say to them. However, Catholics believe that the Word of God is in the Bible, but it's also very important to maintain the traditions of the Church, and also that the Pope has the authority over that religion and must be listened to. Protestants don't need to listen to the Pope. Catholics believe that they should listen to the Pope. This infographic also helps us show how different Catholicism is versus Protestantism. So in the Catholic Church, God is obviously on the throne. God is the most important being, with Jesus, his son, underneath, and the apostles who followed him. And then the way that we receive our information is through tradition and scripture and church. But if you look at the information on Protestants, the traditions and the church are less important, and the only thing that really matters is what is in the Bible itself. Now, you will already know about King Henry VIII and his 6 wives, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, who was tragically executed, and Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard and eventually Catherine Parr. But the most important thing I can tell you here is that Henry did produce a male heir. His male heir was Henry VI. Now, the problem that happened when Henry VIII died in 1547 is that his son, Edward, was named king at the age of 9. Edward was raised a Protestant, so continued to rule England as a Protestant nation like his father, and made more formal changes than Henry made. He was very much governed by a group of people around him who helped him on his way. Because of his age, the realm was governed by a regency council, made up of trusted advisors led by Edward Seymour, his uncle. Further problems are added into this narrative when we realize that Edward VI was a very sickly child, and in 1553, at the age of 15, he died. The one thing that Henry VIII tried to do was to make sure his country was stable after his death with a male heir, and that male heir dies at 15. Now, Edward VI knew of his impending death, so he tried to declare his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir, and that she should succeed him, and he declared his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who will pop up later, he tried to make them illegitimate so that they didn't have a claim on the throne. Lady Jane Grey was a Protestant, and a major reason why Edward VI preferred her to the throne instead of Mary, because Mary was a devout Catholic, and if Mary were given the throne, she would try and change the entire country back into a Catholic nation. Now, while Jane was crowned, stakeholders surrounding the crown preferred Mary as a successor, and they changed their allegiances and they plotted to make sure that Mary would be the next queen and to get rid or depose Lady Jane Grey. And with that support, Mary did manage to seize the throne, and she was crowned just 9 days after Jane became queen. And Jane was later executed. Lady Jane Grey is often referred to as the 9 days queen. That's how long her time on the throne was. As Lady Jane Grey was deposed, Mary I became queen, and you will know that Mary I is known as Bloody Mary. Mary was a devout Catholic and made an aggressive attempt to reverse the Reformation began for her father. Henry changed the entire country from one religion to another. Mary tried to reverse that decision. And she really aggressively enforced her Catholic beliefs, and she had over 280 religious dissenters burnt at the stake. I think that's what gave her the nickname of Bloody Mary. Now, Mary was 37 when she became queen, and her immediate thoughts were she needed to get married and to produce a male heir as quickly as possible to stop the throne going to her sister, Elizabeth. Because Elizabeth was Protestant, Mary I wanted England to be Catholic, and she wanted her son to continue that legacy. She married Prince Philip of Spain, although there were many concerns about this, because England might be passed over to Spain to rule, as the laws of Jura Uxoris states the husband inherits the lands and titles of the wife. Mary and Philip married in 1554, and Mary had a false pregnancy but died childless in 1558, and prior to her death, Mary had to name Elizabeth as her successor, again causing tension in the religious attitudes of the population. Which leads us to the reign of Elizabeth I. And you'll notice that Elizabeth I's life was long, from 1533 to 1603, and she became nicknamed the Virgin Queen. We've looked at Elizabethan rules and Elizabethan expectations and Elizabethan courtship when we've looked at Sonnet 130. Elizabeth became queen in 1558, and she sought to rule by good advice and counsel. She sought the advice of a close group of trusted advisors and wanted multiple viewpoints before making decisions. And I think as a modern thinker, I think we quite like the idea of someone who is willing to listen to people without being completely flattered by them, and then to make a decision when they have all of the information. It sounds like good leadership. It's not the type of leadership we saw from Henry VIII. One of her first acts, unsurprisingly, was to return England to Protestantism, continuing the direction of her father, Henry VIII, and half-brother Edward VI. And they'd led the country down that path, and she wanted to make sure they continued. She named herself as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and she ruled for 44 years, finally bringing some stability to the monarchy after a period of turbulence. Think about how stressful it would be to live in England with Henry VIII and then a young child as a king, and then a 9 days queen, and then Bloody Mary and her campaign to change the entire country once more. Elizabeth I offered stability. And her reign was successful. She wanted to make England a fairer place for all and was far less brutal than her sister. She championed the arts, she supported the theatres, and even invited the Lord Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare's Theatre Company, to perform at court. And one of the reasons why the Renaissance was able to flourish is because of the stability that Elizabeth I offered in England. And she ruled during a time of great scientific discovery, and England grew much stronger. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and in 1603, Elizabeth I died. Elizabeth I died without an heir. She deliberately did not marry because she didn't want to give England's power away. She decided to live without a husband so that she didn't have to devolve that power. She could keep England strong by being chaste and by being virginal and not allowing someone to take away any power. So upon her death, James VI of Scotland, who was also the Lord of Ireland, was announced as her successor. And he had the opportunity as James I, formerly James VI of Scotland, he became James I of England, and for the first time, England, Scotland, and Ireland became united as one country. Now, his reign isn't known as the James era, it's known as the Jacobean era, Jacob being the Latin term for James. James was a devout Protestant, so that was perfect because it allowed some continuity from Elizabeth's reign. At least the whole country is not going to change its religion again. But he was tolerant of Catholics, and he allowed them to practice their religion as long as if they conformed with the country's laws. So few executions were sanctioned. He was a devout Protestant. Now, many Catholics hoped that he would convert to Catholicism after his mother's execution, but he remained a Protestant. And in February 1604, the Pope sent a rosary to James's wife through one of his spies, and this was a deliberate offensive to show that if James didn't do what he was told, which was to change the country back, that the Pope had the ability to infiltrate and the Pope had the ability to hurt him. And after this, James became angry and he ordered all of the Catholic priests to leave the country and would fine them if they continued to remain. And in 1604, James assembled the Hampton Court Conference, and along with 47 members of the Church of England, he commissioned a translation of the Christian Bible into English. And that text was completed in 1611. Despite his coronation running smoothly and the general population celebrating his accession, there were two attempts upon his life: byplot and the main plot. These were by Catholic dissidents who wished to depose James in favour of a Catholic regent. And I think anyone in the UK knows the story of those people who tried to blow him up in Parliament. Gunpowder Plot of 1605 was a major attempt to blow up the Houses of Parliament, James I, his family, and his close advisers. The plot, as we know, failed, and the country was relieved that the plot failed, and it did inspire more loyalty towards the king at that time. James retaliated by strengthening laws against Catholics and imposing much heavier fines against them. The aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot, it meant that there was a palpable mood of fear and intolerance. People feared foreign espionage because of the Catholic Church's opposition to England's Protestant rule. There were fears that an uprising would take place and that there would be an attempt to seize power. And the Gunpowder Plot exposed the fragility of the king's position and the need for careful diplomacy. And it also demonstrated the importance of a succession plan, an heir to the throne that could not be disputed. Now, at the start of the video, I told you that this was a very tumultuous time in England's history. And all the way through Shakespeare's life, he would have lived under the Elizabethan rule. And yet at this time, we see Shakespeare in his plays begin to write heavily about countries being split up and kings being killed. And it's because in a direct link to what was happening in the country at the time. He wrote King Lear about a king who split up his country into three. I mean, this was a king that could bring the three countries together. He wrote Macbeth about a king who gets murdered by somebody he doesn't even suspect of doing any wrong, and then he himself becoming a tyrant. It's not a surprise that the writers of the time started to write about what it means to be a good king when things like the Gunpowder Plot were happening. In 1625, on James's death, his son Charles I was crowned King of England. Now, Charles I was brought up by his father, James I, to believe that he had the power of God, that he was selected from all of the creatures on the earth to be God's hand on earth. And that level of power that was inspired by James I led to his downfall. And in his life, he made some mistakes. Charles married Henrietta Maria of France in 1625, and she was a Catholic. Now think about all of the changes that we've seen in the religion of England. For this king to marry a Catholic, it was seen as a very unpopular thing to do, particularly with his subjects. People became distrustful of Charles's religious views when he did this. And Charles's relationship with Parliament soured, and he tried to take money from Parliament. He wanted a forced loan. He was spending huge amounts of money and he wanted to continue a lavish lifestyle. And Parliament were becoming increasingly frustrated by Charles's attitude of being able to do what he wants. Scotland became agitated when Charles tried to make religious changes and tried to impose religious texts upon them. And Parliament tried to impeach Charles in 1640. They wanted to remove him from the throne. In 1642, Parliament assembled an army and they seized London. Charles raised an army of his own supporters, and this began the English Civil War. The country was at war with itself. You had those who supported the royal family, and you had those who supported Parliament. In 1646, after a military defeat, Charles fled to Scotland. In 1647, Charles was handed to the English by the Scottish. And Charles, the king, was tried for treason, using his power for his own personal interest rather than the good of the country in 1649. And throughout his trial, he refused to make a plea. He argued his actions were not to be questioned because he was appointed by God. He was executed in 1649. If we have a quick recap of the Reformation, take a look at how the religion was constantly changing at this time, from Catholicism to Protestantism during Henry VIII's reign, to trying to pass it on to Edward and to Lady Jane Grey, and then it went back, it reverted to Catholicism with Bloody Mary and then returned to Protestantism. You can see why people were frustrated when Charles I made decisions that showed that perhaps more turbulence was coming once more. People enjoyed the calm and peace and the defensive attitudes of Elizabeth rather than offensive attitudes. I think James I caused people to be worried that the Reformation would be under threat. We looked at James I, and we've seen the gunpowder plot, people willing to kill in order to return the country to the religion that they wanted. We saw when the country was passed from James I to Charles I, we ended in the English Civil War between the Cavaliers, the Royalists, and the Roundheads, the Parliamentarians, because he married a Catholic and he fell out with Parliament and he tried to get his forced loan. In 1649, when Charles I was executed, England stopped being a monarchy. There was no king or queen, and instead it declared itself a commonwealth. In 1653, Oliver Cromwell was made Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. Now, Oliver Cromwell was a devout Puritan, and he treated Catholics harshly and wanted England to be a country who rid themselves of the country's Catholic influences for good. His Puritan roots need to be investigated. Puritans were members of a religious reform movement known as Puritanism that arose within the Church of England in the late 16th century. They believed the Church of England was too similar to the Roman Catholic Church and should eliminate ceremonies and practices not rooted in the Bible. Puritans felt that they had a direct covenant with God to enact these reforms. In the siege from church and crown, certain groups of Puritans migrated to northern English colonies in the New World in the 1620s and 1630s. Lots of people moved over to America because they wanted to get away from the persecution they felt when they were in Europe. And this laid the foundation for the religious, intellectual, and social order of New England over in America. Aspects of Puritanism have reverberated through American life ever since. Now, I told you the history was going to be extensive for this poem, because it won't just help you with this poem, it'll help you for others too. But the rise of Puritanism needs to be understood. In 1530, John Calvin began preaching in Geneva, and his increasingly popular ideas argued that all aspects of the Catholic Church had misled Christianity. From its theology and Bible to its hierarchy, ritual and pageantry, the church needed to be reformed. So Calvin argued that changes needed to be made. As Britain went through the Reformation, there was a tendency to adopt characteristics of both Catholicism and Protestantism, and Puritans did not like the compromise, but they wished instead to follow Calvin's lead in banishing all Catholic elements from the church because they wanted to purify the religion. They wanted to strip out those elements of Catholicism and to look at their religion in a pure way. And Puritans had their own Bible translation. They called it the Geneva Bible. Not only was it small and therefore inexpensive, but it also had extensive notes that explained biblical passages using Puritan theology. Since this Bible was the only book many people owned or read, it was effective in winning people over to Puritan theological beliefs and keeping them there. Although most of the notes were innocuous or merely radical Calvinist theology, other notes argued against current political and religious structures. In particular, Calvinism believed in neither the divine right of kings to rule, a belief strongly promoted by James, nor that the church should be governed by bishops, but rather by community elders elected by congregations. The former angered the king, while the latter incensed the church hierarchy. It was because of the Geneva Bible that James I wanted to create his own version of the Bible. And it was to combat this subversive Bible that James and his bishops decided to create a new Bible translation in the first place. James had authorized the new translation with a decree that included several guidelines for the translators. The most significant part was the command to have no notes in the text apart from short remarks about translation. This stricture prevented remarks linking the biblical text to unwanted perspectives and political positions. After the King James Version of the Bible was published in 1611, the Geneva Bible was banned in England. James made ownership of the Geneva Bible a crime, and King James Bible became the pulpit Bible for Anglicans, and inexpensive copies were published for sale to the masses. And this gave Britain a way of reading the words of God firsthand. Now that is a very quick whistle-stop tour of the Reformation, of the end of the Tudor monarchy, of the beginning of the Stuart monarchy, and how the king was executed and Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector instead. It might not have felt very quick, but there is so much more I could have said. That's how I wanted to share some of the context behind the poet of John Milton. John Milton lived from 1608 to 1674. Hence why I've gone into so much detail about that area of history. So if you think of his birth, 1608, it was under the rule of James I. He wasn't alive during the reign of Elizabeth, like Shakespeare might have been. John Milton's father was disowned by his devout Catholic family for becoming a Puritan. And Milton was educated to an extraordinary standard, often being considered one of the most learned of all poets. Milton got married and was dissatisfied with his marriage, and Milton wrote pamphlets suggesting divorce should be allowed outside of the rule of adultery. He believed that divorce was an acceptable route, whilst Catholicism would say absolutely the opposite. When Parliament won the Civil War, Milton wrote in defense of the country being a commonwealth instead of a monarchy. He wrote about how he thought it was important for the people to hold their rulers to account, and implicitly sanctioned the execution of the king. And this is where it becomes apparent that you needed to know the previous context in order for you to understand Milton's position. So Milton was a real supporter of England without a monarchy. He didn't want to have a king and a queen. He wanted the Commonwealth to continue. He didn't think one person gets the right of God like James I or Henry VIII or Charles I believed. He didn't believe in the divine right of kings. He felt like that was too much power for a royal family to hold. Milton was appointed Secretary to Foreign Tongues by the Council of State in March 1649. And his main job description was to compose the English Republic's foreign correspondence in Latin and other languages, but he also was called upon to produce propaganda for the regime and to serve as a censor. Milton was a stout defender of Oliver Cromwell, even writing one of his other sonnets, Sonnet 16, for Oliver Cromwell. He wrote in opposition to the growing desire to return England to a monarchy. When he was writing, there were lots of people in society who believed that the execution of James I was a mistake. To kill their own king was a mistake made by the country, and there were lots of people desperate to return the country to a monarchy. John Milton did not believe there should be a king. He was opposed to what has become known as the Restoration, where Charles II was restored to the throne. John Milton did not want England to have a king. And I believe it's only now that you're ready to start understanding the poem. Without an understanding of what Puritanism is, I don't think we'd fully understand the poem. Without understanding the turbulence of the past regimes from the monarchy, we wouldn't understand the poem. Without understanding that Charles I was executed, that Parliament rose up and deposed him, we wouldn't understand this poem. Without understanding that Oliver Cromwell was in charge of the country, he was the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, we wouldn't understand the poem itself. So my next job is to read this poem to you. And here is Sonnet 19. When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labour, light denied? I fondly ask. And patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed, and post over land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. Now, just having a first read through of that poem, you'll have lots of questions and there will be lots of parts that perhaps don't make sense yet. But I'd like to start off by showing you the structure of this poem. You'll notice on your screen there are 14 lines. You'll notice that those lines are pretty consistent, and you'll have seen this type of structure already. This poem is split into an octave at the beginning, 8 lines, and then finishes with a sestet at the end. You'll notice that about halfway through, we get the word but, that conjunction, that connective. And that fronted connective we can call a volta. Just like the other sonnets you've seen, there is a turn in this poem when one idea is then replaced by another that actually perhaps explains away the first half of the poem. The volta here shows that perhaps the first 8 lines were explaining something in a way that wasn't fully thought through, and the final 6 lines bring you to the real meaning behind that poem. If we take a look at the rhyme scheme, you'll see a very consistent pattern of rhyming all of the way through. We see that spent rhymes perfectly with bent, and present and prevent, and wide, hide, chide, and denied all rhyme with each other. In the octave, there are only 2 rhyming sounds. The change after the volta brings the change of the rhyme scheme. We have need rhyming with speed, best and rest, and state and wait. The rhyme scheme therefore can be diagnosed as ABB, AABBA, CDE, CDE. And I think the change in the pattern from the octave to the sestet accompanies the change in this person's thinking, in their viewpoint. We can therefore call Sonnet 19 a Petrarchan sonnet. It's definitely not a Shakespearean sonnet that normally has that rhyming couplet at the end, perhaps split up into 3 quatrains and then a rhyming couplet, rather than the octave and sestet that we see in this poem. So we can refer to it as a Petrarchan sonnet. Now, normally when we see the word sonnet, we think of a love poem. We think of a declaration of love, usually from, at this time, a man written towards a woman. And the word sonnet here perhaps reflects a little bit of the views of Milton. So instead of this being an erotic poem written glorifying the beauty of a woman, instead Milton's sonnet has stripped out that eroticism and replaced it with a much purer relationship with God. And I think that reflects his Puritan roots. Now, Sonnet 19 is accompanied with this little extra tag on the end, on his blindness. And it's important to realize that Milton, in his middle age, started losing his eyesight. And in 1650, he was becoming blind. And this is obviously a massive problem for someone like Milton, because he had forged a career through his exceptional ability to read and to write. And without his eyesight, he felt he would not be able to do God's will. He felt like God had a plan for him, and it was part of his role to do what God wanted. Now, throughout his life, Milton was able to become an incredibly famous poet, and he was employed by the government. He was in charge of writing letters. He was in charge of creating pamphlets showing that Oliver Cromwell was a good leader of this country and that we didn't need a king anymore. He felt like that was part of his plan. He felt like part of God's plan was to use his skills and his talents to make the type of England that he foresaw, to bring England to a more pure relationship with God. Without his eyesight, he felt like God was taking away the one thing that he wanted him to do. And there's an irony that his one talent requires him to be able to see, and that was the one thing that he was losing. Now we can see the kind of imagery of dwindling light and how Milton, this person with exceptional ability, was moving towards the later part of his life, plunged into darkness, away from that one thing that he was most skilled at. As we start taking a look at the first couple of lines, the meaning behind this poem reveals itself quite quickly. The first line, when I consider how my light is spent, knowing that John Milton lost his eyesight, the part of the sentence where it says light is spent starts to make a little more sense. Now, the first word used is the use of the word when, and here it sets up the beginning of this poem as a conditional clause. It means that the octave that we're about to see has a condition through the fronted coordinating conjunction when. And it moves on to say when I consider. Now, the word consider suggests that Milton is questioning something, perhaps challenging something, looking at something in lots of detail, and it suggests a feeling of dissatisfaction and disappointment. He's pondering on the fact that he's losing his eyesight, and it makes him question something. And it moves on to how my light is spent. And this links with that pronoun I used at the beginning to show that he's frustrated. He's focusing on what he has lost. He's not necessarily thinking of others. He's not thinking of what God might be doing. There's a selfishness here where he's just considering his own issue and his own problem. And where it says light, we have that loss of sight. He focuses on what he did have, but also how what he did have is now dwindling away. Now, the word light, the light imagery used here, definitely has connotations of religion. So we've got this idea that by losing his ability to do what God wants him means that he's also losing his relationship with God. He no longer serves a purpose. He was no longer put on this earth to do something. So the feeling of losing his eyesight is also the feeling of losing his purpose on earth. The final word of this line is the word spent. It's a verb. And the verb spent shows that he's focusing on what he has lost, or perhaps in his view, how he's had something cruelly ripped away from him. All of his light is gone. It's all been used up. And now he's being plunged into a world of darkness. And the next line begins with the word ear, which means before. And I think there's a feeling that he hasn't done what he needs to do in his life. He still has things to do. Remember, Milton lost his eyesight halfway through his life. It wasn't at the end of his life when he'd completed all of his missions and he'd done what God wanted him to do. There's a feeling that his eyesight was lost too early, and therefore it means that he cannot do what he was placed on earth to do. And half my days here shows that premature loss of his ability. And he feels that sense of injustice. Why did this have to happen now? And he feels like he can no longer achieve the role he has been given. And it moves on to juxtaposing the light in the first line to now the dark world to where he's going to have to spend the rest of his life. He was living in God's light, and now God has abandoned him and plunged him into darkness. And that dark imagery shows that he feels lost, completely alone in a dark, wide world that no longer values him. And he's perhaps even questioning his religious belief here, that loss of light. And maybe he feels like he cannot contribute, and he's been robbed of the capacity to interact with the world. So his life used to be in the light. It used to be doing things in the government that would actually make a difference. It used to be writing poetry that could teach, that could show, that could add something to the world. And it's all being pulled away from him so that he spends the rest of his life in this cold, dark world where nothing is there to offer him anything. Now, in those first two lines, you've probably noticed that there are some repeated sounds. The first I'd like to bring out for you is the W sound in world and wide. Now, that alliteration could show the bitterness or perhaps the frustration that Milton might be feeling. Now, if you think about Milton questioning why God has done something, we can also consider these opening lines quite blasphemous. It isn't Milton's job, it isn't any human's job to question the will of God. And yet, he spends the first 8 lines of his poem questioning God's authority, questioning his decision making. And as a result, we can see that bitterness and frustration perhaps overstepping his mark. You may also have noticed the frequent D's that are used all the way through. And if you have a quick look, it says, when I consider how my light is spent, half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged in me useless. That frequent use of that D sound could be considered dental plosive alliteration for those words that begin with the letter D, and consonance for those words that contain that sound. And if you think of the sound, it is harsh and it is heavy, perhaps showing his frustration or his dissatisfaction. Those D sounds really show us this sinking feeling that he must have felt as he started losing his eyesight and turning blind. So at the beginning of this poem, there definitely is a tone of disappointment. The word wide really does show the feeling that Milton might have been going through. He must have felt that without his eyesight, he was going to be plunged into this enormous vastness of darkness and become completely lost. He felt like he was entering an abyss with no light at all, and therefore no purpose to carry on living, to carry on being who he was. And the next line, and that one talent, that one is a determiner, because he feels like he was given a singular gift by God to glorify him. And yet he feels like his entire identity is going to be lost without his ability to use those intellectual abilities. It's that irony. He's been given something and he won't be able to do what he needs to do without it. And then we get the reference to the Bible in talent, which is death to hide. This is a biblical allusion, and it refers to a story in Matthew called the parable of the talents. And in this story, a talent was a unit of biblical money, and a wealthy man, so the story says, gives his servants some money to invest while he goes away. And 2 of his servants do exactly that. They invest the money they were given and they earn a profit for their master. But the 3rd servant didn't do it. He didn't invest the money. He felt like he wanted to protect that money instead. So instead of investing it, he buried that talent in the ground. And this was seen as a sin. And in the story, he was punished for doing it. The master even suggests that he will go to hell for his failure. And the meaning behind this story is that if God chooses you to have a talent, there is an expectation that you use that talent to glorify God. You don't hide your talent, you don't bury your talent, pretend like you weren't giving it. To do so would be to not glorify God. God has chosen you for a talent, so there is an expectation you use it. And that is probably how Milton felt. He has been given a talent by God, and yet that talent is now being taken away from him. And that talent is death to hide. The word death shows that he's fearing that his inability to glorify God with his talent leaves him completely useless. And it's almost like he's living a death because he cannot contribute to God's divine plan anymore. He was once useful. He was once able to do what God wanted him to do, and he's lost that ability for good. Now, the next line begins with lodged with me useless. And the word lodge shows to stay within, because his talent is wasted. It exists within him, but it cannot be used anymore. And he's feeling that it's greatly unfair that he has a talent inside of him that he'll no longer be able to use. And it renders him feeling useless. Useless means that without his sight, he can no longer do what he needs to do. He's excluded from being able to contribute. And he's almost doomed to live the rest of his life knowing that he could contribute, but has lost the ability to do so. Then we move on to, though my soul more bent. The word more here is an intensifier. He hasn't lost the desire to use his talent. He's lost the ability to do it. His mind continues with ideas. But it's tragic that he won't be able to continue because he has been robbed of the tools to do so. So though my soul, the soul here, that abstract noun, is more bent. And the word bent here shows that he is continuing to be determined. He still has something to offer. His job is not finished. His mission is not complete. He has the will to do so, but has lost the ability. Like a bow that is bent, he is ready to set these arrows into the world. But unfortunately, he's lost the ability forever. And it's almost like, and through the word soul there, that religious term soul, it's almost like he has lost his purpose. We pause here for a second on these 4 lines. You'll notice at the end of each line, there are no end stops. Here you can see that there's no caesura, and it becomes almost disorientating. And perhaps that's matching the feeling of loss in the poetic voice. Perhaps he's lost in a world of darkness, and these lines are almost lost in his frustration. Enjambment is quite clear to see, but also you'll notice that the word my links with the word I, and we have frequent use of first person personal pronouns. And I think that's for a purpose, because at the beginning of this poem, the poet is focusing on himself. They're very much focused on what they will no longer be able to do, and they've lost sight that they're not in control. They've lost sight that it is God's decision what happens, not his own. So perhaps that repetition of first personal pronouns shows the egocentrism of Milton. When wounded with his blindness, he starts looking inside himself at his own frustrations and doesn't actually open up and perhaps look a little wider and consider, is this part of God's will also? In the next 4 lines, we can see perhaps why he doesn't want to lose his eyesight. And he says, it's to serve therewith my Maker. Now, the verb serve shows a desire to contribute and to be useful. He wants to be a conduit for God's plan. He wants to continue doing what God put him on earth to do. And again, he asks, my Maker, because he seeks that personal connection to God. Perhaps he's a little too focused on his own desire to be important rather than what God is actually asking him to do. You'll see the noun maker, and that proper noun with a capital M shows that he sees God as the architect and himself as a tool to enact his will. And perhaps in this first octave, perhaps he considers himself important to God, almost like God needs him to do something. And perhaps in the last 6 lines, that is what becomes inverted. In these first 8 lines, he makes out as if God needs him. And that, I think, is part of his hubris. That's part of his egocentrism. That's part of him thinking he's important. And later on in the poem, he realizes actually, it is God who has all of the power. and God does not need him to do things. And then he moves on and says, and present my true account. The word present here shows that he wants to send his labour into the world to be received by others. He wants to present what he has to the world. And he wants to present my true account. He wants to prove his virtue. He wants God to see that he has complied with those expectations and done what he's been asked. He wants to have a life that means something, and he feels like his life can only mean something if he's doing God's work. Then we have, lest he returning chide. That conjunction shows that he's fearing disappointing. He doesn't want God to tell him, you didn't do what I wanted you to do. And God has the capacity to chide. The verb chide here, it means punishment. He fears being punished for not glorifying God through his labour. And that's a very Catholic view. In Catholicism, your work pleases God. To be busy, to be productive, glorifies God. But Puritans don't believe that. Puritans consider the only way to glorify God was through Scripture, was through the Bible, was through being pure. It then moves on to words inside speech marks. And this is Milton questioning God, questioning his will, questioning his wisdom. And to question God using that interrogative sentence, that can be considered perhaps blasphemous. Milton is not powerful enough to question his authority. That is not his job. That is no human's job. To question God might be considered blasphemous. Now, he does it out of desperation because he wants to please God and he wants to continue being useful and to serve a purpose. But to ever question God is a blasphemous action. And he asks him, doth God exact day labour, light denied? The verb exact here means to demand or to expect. And he points out the irony that God is asking him to do work, but he's taking the ability to perform it away. And that's the irony, that's the frustration he feels. He feels like God is asking him to keep being faithful, to keep doing his work, but has taken away his ability to do it. Then we get the word day labour. And day labour means work that can only be achieved during or in light. And that's his writing. He can't write when his life has been plunged into darkness. So God has given him a job that he can only do in the light. And then you get the juxtaposition at the end of this line, which is light denied. And you'll notice here that we've got different sounds. You've got the plosive sounds, the dental plosives, doth, day, denied. And you've got the L alliteration, labour and light. Perhaps that alliteration shows his disrespectful challenging of God by asking that question. It shows his dissatisfaction. It shows he's not happy. And those sounds in the words themselves reveal that dissatisfaction. Where we see I fondly ask, the word fondly is an adverb, and he's trying to show us that he's asking this question not disrespectfully. He's wanting the answer so that he can do what God wants him to do. So perhaps it's a disrespectful question, but he doesn't mean it disrespectfully. So maybe it actually shows that he's perhaps a little naive or foolish to think that's how important he is. And the dynamic verb ask shows that blasphemous questioning of God's will. in his desperation to be useful, he's actually doing the opposite of what he's supposed to do. Now, the first proper caesura that we see in this poem happens at this line. You get the full stop after the word ask. This poem then moves on to its second sentiment. Perhaps the answer to this question is what happens later. Then, halfway through line 8, we get a stop before the final ideas of the poem are revealed. And these final ideas essentially answer the anxiety that we saw in those first lines. It's at this point that Milton's understanding becomes greater, and he moves away from selfishly thinking about his purpose, and he starts shifting away and starts thinking it's not his purpose he should focus on, it's actually God's purpose that is more important. And halfway through line 8, we get the volta, but it's a fronted conjunction here. Normally in a sonnet, the line with the volta is line 9. It's a little bit earlier in this poem. And he starts with, but patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies. Now that volta shows the beginning of this revelation. It comes early, it cuts off the speaker from his immature, perhaps naive way of thinking, and the final lines reveal the ironic blindness of the speaker, who assumes that labour is needed for religious satisfaction, and that's a Catholic belief. So perhaps in his blindness, he actually sees more clearly at the end of this poem, because he realizes his value is not from what he does with his talents, but perhaps it's his willingness to be commanded by God that is really what is needed. Now the term patience here, it becomes personified. Patience is inside of Milton, and it takes over as the voice of this poem. And that personification is the virtuous characteristic of those who can wait without becoming agitated or frustrated. And it's not an external voice, it's an internal voice. The voice inside of him reveals the errors of his previous thinking, and it's the patience voice that dominates this final sestet. It says, but patience to prevent that murmur. And the dynamic verb prevent is stopping the questioning, and that is even more valuable than that industriousness of his talent. Sometimes to not do something is actually more valuable than doing something. And he describes it as that murmur. And that murmur, that voice, that noise, that thing that was speaking can be considered onomatopoeia. And there are connotations there of discontent, perhaps linking to the discontent of the royalists who sought to reform the monarchy and end the Commonwealth. What he's saying is, if there is someone in society who has become frustrated, who feels like they need to take action, they feel like in order for God to really be honoured, they have to decide to bring back a king and to restore this country to a monarchy. Sometimes we have to avoid being tempted to act because we should step back and perhaps not act. And that's how we really glorify God. And it says it soon replies. And that suggests that answers are given to people who are patient, not those who demand satisfaction. So if you are too quick to act, you won't actually hear the wisdom that you can learn from these types of occurrences. And you'll notice that we do have some alliteration in this line, but patience, to prevent. But alliteration starts to be stripped out of this final sestet. And it becomes much clearer and much simpler in terms of its style. And that maybe reflects the starker, much more Puritan ideals that come out at the end of this poem. And the voice that replies, and the word replies is used there deliberately, I think to show that sometimes it's by being quiet and it's by being still that you actually get the answers to your problems. It isn't through constantly trying to find the answer by doing things or completing tasks. Sometimes it's important to be still and quiet and to listen to the wisdom that comes. And Patience says this: God does not need either man's work or his own gifts. And what he does is he destroys the argument that God needs human beings. It completely destroys the argument that God is reliant on the labor of men. And what Milton tells us is that God does not need humans. It is humans that need God. He very much places the power back in God's hands and is happy to sacrifice the fact that he doesn't have any sole purpose that he can see. And he says, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. He rejects that God is reliant on us. And that reduces the importance of man, and it reasserts that God is on the throne, not us. We're not worthy to question God's authority. And he uses the terms man's work or his own gifts. The word work there shows it isn't about humans doing things to please God. It's humans doing what God wants, whether that's doing work, using their talents, or not using those talents. It is God who decides what needs to be done. And his own gift shows that these talents given to Milton, they're not Milton's talents, they're God's talents. And it is God who gets to choose whether they are used or not used. And it then says, who best bear his mild yoke? They serve him best. And you'll notice, bear his mild yoke. In this case, a yoke is a harness used by humans on oxen. So it's a way of a human controlling an oxen. So the mild yoke here is to tolerate their labor, just like an oxen has to tolerate the labor that's given by the man. It isn't the ox who decides what work needs to be done. It's the human in that metaphor. And it's the same with God. The human is supposed to do what God wants. It isn't our place to ask God why he isn't using us. So it's not our decision whether we are used as God's instruments. God can do what he wants. He can use us or not use us. It's our job just to listen. It's our job to comply and be ready to do what God wants us to do. So it says, bear his mild yoke. And I think the word mild, that pre-modifying adjective, is deliberately used to show that working for God is not taxing. It's not horrible and awful. It's a job you're willing to do because you know it's for the good of God. And then it says, they serve him best. And I like the way the word serve, that dynamic verb, is used deliberately to show that to follow the will of God is not to second guess it. To follow the will of God is to just do what you're told, not to ask for more, not to demand for help. And this is a Puritan belief, because the way to salvation is not just through doing things. The way to salvation is through faith alone. So they serve him best. His state is kingly. And look at that declarative sentence. It couldn't be any clearer. His is referring to God. Then you've got the term state. And the state here is like the geographical place. It's the dominion of God. And Puritans did not believe in the divine right of kings. Instead, the only ruler should be God. So Milton was in favour of the execution of Charles I, and he actually spoke out publicly against those people who wanted to bring the monarchy back. He actually wrote and said that Charles I uh, should have been executed. And he believed in the Commonwealth, not the monarchy at all. His actively trying to persuade Britain against the Restoration almost caused his own execution. He only narrowly escaped. So what he's doing in this line is showing, look, it isn't man's place to be on the throne. It is all of our place to serve the only true king, and that is God. So his state is kingly. And look how definite it sounds through the word is. The term kingly there shows that it is God who has absolute authority. And it's man's duty to serve, not to question. But you will notice that lexical set of kings and countries. And I think that's direct reference to what was happening in history at the time. I think Milton is very clearly arguing that we shouldn't have a king in England. The only true king that we should all bow down to is God himself. No human being deserves that level of power. After the term kingly, you get a very clear full stop. That caesura is there deliberately. And if you look at the line before, his state is kingly, it's authoritative, it's clear, there's no anxiety there at all. Milton has accepted his place under God. And that caesura very clearly shows that there is no argument. The next line begins with the enumerator, thousands. Thousands at his bidding speed. The term thousands here highlights the insignificance of one individual person amongst the vastness of God's plan. Milton at the beginning of this poem was a little egotistical, thinking that he was important. The end of this poem, he steps back and realizes God has the entire human population to enact his will. And sometimes some people will be needed and sometimes you won't be needed. It's not our position to challenge. It's our position to sometimes wait, be patient, and trust in God's bidding. And he says thousands at his bidding speed. And we've got the term bidding there, which shows that he has the entire population at his disposal. And the word speed shows urgence and diligence. So yes, some people will be used, but others won't. And then the second last line is, and host over land and ocean without rest. So his authority on earth is not limited to geographical locations. The world belongs to God, not single countries like a king. And Puritans sought to bring their beliefs to others, including the New World or America. So God has the decision who gets sent and who gets used and who has to go on these journeys and who has to complete the tasks. It isn't us asking to be used. We just need to wait for God to use us. And the end of that line is without rest, because God's will is enacted always, not just simply during the light, as mentioned earlier. Now in this line, we've got lots of action. We've got bidding speed and post over land and ocean, and you've got this idea of things happening with no rest at all. That lexical set of speed and energy is contrasted with the final line. There is a clear juxtaposition between the lexical set of furious energy in these sentences compared to stand and wait in the final line. And this final line says, they also serve who only stand and wait. Remodifying the adverb also may show that devout people serve God not always in an active capacity, not having to do something just to feel like they're part of it, but actually that they can serve by waiting and being patient and being ready to do what's needed if asked, and also not complaining if they're not needed. And the verb serve is deliberate language of being subservient. And to honour God does not require active labour. Quiet faith is glorifying God. And then it says, who only stand and wait. And I think the word only is used deliberately. And stand and wait are both inactive verbs in juxtaposition to the bidding speed and being posted over land and ocean without rest. The juxtaposition shows that there are lots of different types of serving your God, and one of them is inactive. And to bow down to God's authority, to accept his will and to trust his judgment, that is the true definition of being a good Puritan, of being a good Christian. That is how you can serve your God, not only through action, but also through inaction. Now that we've finished our reading of the sonnet itself, I'm hoping you can see perhaps some of the links between the context I started the video with and the poem that we finished with. Ultimately, Milton shows us that God is the true authority. No king on the throne, no singular figure on earth, not even the people who feel like they've got to do something to be worthy. It is God who has ultimate authority, and our role is simply to bow down before him, to enact what he wants us to do, whether that's active or inactive, and not seek to do something to satisfy our own feelings of incompetence, perhaps, but actually to simply let God do his bidding. Thank you so much for listening to this video. I'm hoping it goes some way to bringing you to some sort of understanding of Sonnet 19 by John Milton.